Here with us today, we are ecstatic to have Dr. Rolph, a colleague that I have closely worked with during my academic visit to NTU. Chris is Director of Nottingham Institute of Education from Nottingham Trent University, England. And thank you, Chris, for allocating your time for us today. Although it's very, very early over there, it's 7:30 in the morning. So before we begin, allow me to do a quick introduction of Chris, which he will then explain further during his talk. Dr. Chris Rolph completed a PhD in astrophysics before teaching in secondary schools. He spent 25 years teaching science, including 13 years leading secondary schools in Lincolnshire, England. In 2016, he joined Nottingham Trent University, where he is now the director of Nottingham Institute of Education. He has taught on a range of undergraduate and initial teacher education courses and supervises master's and doctoral students. Please welcome Dr. Chris Rolph. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Johannes, and good afternoon, everybody. Yes, it is morning here. It's not too early. It's not as early as I thought it was going to be. So normally I'm at my desk by 8 o'clock in the morning in Nottingham. So it's not so much earlier than I would normally be up. And it's a real pleasure to be able to speak to you this morning. It was lovely to host Johannes for a few weeks in Nottingham back in January, February time. To have her over, and a few years before that, I think it was 2019 when I came out to Malaysia, I met some of your colleagues in Kuala Lumpur. So great to be able to talk to you again. And if I can manage to share my slides, I'll explain to you what I'm going to take us through this morning. So yes, I work at Nottingham Trent University. Nottingham's right in the sort of geographical centre of England. So it's in what we call the Midlands, and it serves quite a large regional area, although we have students nationally coming from all over the country. I've just popped this slide on that has quite a lot of our awards that we have won across the bottom. As you can see, I know most universities do this sort of thing. It's not something that I like very much, but I wanted to do it now because it will come up later in what I'm talking about. So just so that you're kind of aware of the sort of university that we have. So this is my plan today, if this is okay with everybody. I'm going to start off with an introduction just to myself and to Nottingham Trent and Nottingham Institute of Education. We'll then have a bit of a tour of England's neoliberal policy context, and we need to do that in order to understand where we are as a university later on. Otherwise, it kind of won't work if you don't understand the context. And specifically, I'm going to look at how neoliberalism has affected curriculum. And that mostly relates to schools for reasons which I'll come back to. But we will come back to higher education later. Then we'll have a little break where we might have a little bit of a discussion or any questions around that. Then we'll move on and start to think specifically about pedagogy and how policy is having an impact in classrooms. Then you'll see another little break, so we might have a few more questions and a small discussion there. And then finally, we will get to higher education and pedagogy in higher education. So I'm hoping that that sounds okay. So this is me. As Johannes said, I did my first degree, my PhD, and then I did a postdoc in astrophysics. So which I really enjoyed. I still think of myself as a physicist, but I was very eager to start teaching. And here in the UK, it's quite a long route to get from being a subject specialist to securing a job as a lecturer. And I was too impatient to do that. I wanted to move into a teaching role more rapidly. So I became a teacher in a secondary school, teaching physics. Taught in secondary schools for around about 10 or 11 years, I think, before I became a principal. And secondary schools here, I should say, are for children who are age 11 through to 19. So I was a principal of a secondary school and over time became principal of 3 different secondary schools. And then in 2016, as Johannes said, I moved to Nottingham Institute of Education, initially as a principal lecturer and then director of the Institute. And this is a job that I really love because it includes teaching, which I'm really passionate about, and hopefully some of that passion will come back to by the end of this presentation. So there's the teaching there. I do a little bit of teaching science teachers. So there's still a little bit of science in there, probably not as much as I would like. But obviously I'm a researcher as well. And so research is important to me. And what I've got here, within the Institute, we share slides, mostly with our own students. So this is not very public facing normally, but with our own students, we share slides that just give them an idea of what our background is and the sorts of research that we do. I know you won't have time to read all of this while I'm talking, but it just gives you an idea of the sorts of things that we would share with our students to say, these are the people that are teaching you. And what it says on here, obviously, is that I taught in schools for 20 years. During that time, I got really interested in leadership in particular. Leadership was a very big thing politically in the early 2000s here. And I found it really interesting. This is another seminar altogether, but there's lots of programs, models of leadership, things you can buy to do with leadership, and especially around leadership of change. And my argument at the time, and I think still is that that change is really, really complex, and that leading it is therefore very difficult. And not always as straightforward as some of these models would make out. So that gave me an interest in researching leadership. I did a couple of leadership projects while I was still a principal. Obviously, I'm interested in pedagogy and what happens in the classroom. And as you'll see, because of our political structure, accountability and performativity are really important themes in education in England. And I became interested in those as well. So those are my kind of main areas of research. Currently working on a couple of projects. One of them is looking at training for our social workers that work with young people who are really disadvantaged, and trying to, well, evaluating some training to see basically how effective it is in building resilience for those social workers. And then a really interesting piece of work around some of our disadvantaged communities, where young people leave school and don't end up in work. Even if they go to university, they might leave school, go to university, get their degree, but then they go back to the hometown and don't end up in employment. So a piece of work around that, which I've just secured a new PhD to do. So hopefully that'll go on for the next few years. I've mentioned a few times disadvantaged communities, and you know, this is a driver for me to see what we can do to help those people for whom education isn't yet the liberating experience that it was for me. You know, I found a lot of freedom through education. It opened doors to me that I wasn't expecting, took me to places that I didn't think I could go, and it was all because of what education gave me. And what we recognise here in England is that there are quite a number of young people for whom that isn't the case. So that's my driving force, really, whether I'm working with university students or children in schools, or even other colleagues, is to say that, you know, you have to make the most of your education, and then use it to take you on a really exciting journey in life. And so I'm really driven to make sure that that's what we see in all of our young people as they come out of school, as they come out of university. So that's a bit about me. With regard to Nottingham Institute of Education, I don't know what Johannes has told you, but this is a little bit about our department. So the first thing is to say the Institute of Education is a department that sits in a very big university. So Nottingham Trent University has about 35,000 undergraduate students. I think it's the 5th biggest university in England, so it's quite large. So my department, which I look after, has a faculty of 75 and around about 1,600 students. And half of those are training to be teachers. So they might be undergraduates, they might be postgraduates who've already done a bachelor's degree, but either way, half of them are training to teach in early years providers, primary schools, secondary schools, or post-compulsory adult education colleges, and so on. So we cover the full range of education, all the way from birth right through to adulthood. So this is the Institute. So I've told you about teacher training, and the other half of our students, so they would be studying education. And that might be through a foundation degree, a bachelor's degree, master's degrees, and doctoral study, where we run both a PhD and an EdD. And some of the expertise that we've got within our faculty, you can see in the bullet points on the left-hand side. I'll keep on making references to my slides, and then you can shout if you can't see what I'm talking about. On the right-hand side, just a little map there. So the last count that we did, we had students from 50 countries around the world. So quite an international mix of students. One of the things that's a little bit difficult around that, and especially about students going the other way, is that our regulations are so tight that our teacher training students can't spend any time outside of English schools. Which is really frustrating for us, but that's a national legislation, so it's quite difficult for our students to go in the other direction. But it's nice to have international students coming in, and relationships like this one are really beneficial in enriching our institute. So some of the expertise that my colleagues might be interested in and would be researching in: social policy, comparative education, looking in particular internationally at different kinds of approaches, pedagogy, both general classroom pedagogy, but also very subject specific. So in particular subjects, English, maths, technology, science. Some of my colleagues are very focused and national leaders on pedagogy in those subjects. And we do quite a lot of work on outdoor education, which isn't in the English curriculum, but we think is a really important enrichment. So especially with younger children, doing work on how to teach in the outdoors. I've already talked about leadership. And then special educational needs and disabilities. We run a degree in special educational needs, and again have a number of national experts on that. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. And obviously all of that sits within the English context, which is what I'm going to take you into and take us through now. So this is the structure. We've done the introduction. We'll go through some neoliberal policy, have a break, pedagogy, little conversation, and then higher education, which we'll come back to. By way of an advert, I've put my book up there, which was just published last month. So what I'm going to talk about now is basically chapter 7 and chapter 8 from this book on education policy. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back in time to the 1970s, and then we'll go through this presentation, and by the time we get to the end, we'll be back in the 1970s again, but we will come to that via the present day. So 1970s, English education was, by all accounts, in a bit of a mess, really. This was when I was just finishing school. I was in secondary school in the 1970s. And it was generally accepted that education had become so progressive, so child-focused, that things were becoming really difficult. There was no real sense nationally of what children were learning. There was a real sense of liberalism that people were uncomfortable with. There was no ability to monitor what was going on in schools. Nobody could check whether money was being spent properly. There were no established benchmarks for national standards, so nobody really knew what should be happening in schools. We did have inspectors, but they were very much independent. So what one inspector did might be very different to what another inspector did. So they had no benchmarking system and nothing to relate their inspections to. And there was no kind of joined up thinking between schools and business. So getting children into employment at the end of the day, nobody really understood whose role that would be. And then examinations, there were lots and lots of different examination boards. Schools could choose which ones they did. Some were relatively easy, some were harder. Some gave different sorts of grades. So it was a real muddle. And this was pinpointed in 1976 by the then Prime Minister, Jim Callaghan, in what came to be known as the Ruskin speech. So he gave this long speech, but in the middle of it, this little section that I've put here, where he talks about the need really to address many of these problems. Now, the important thing to realize here is he is a Labour Prime Minister. So he is from the left, political left, and he's saying we've got all of these problems because we've got progressive liberalism that's just run away from itself, and we don't know what's happening in our schools. Not many people disagreed with that. So it opened up what was called at the time the Great Debate. So he initiated a debate across the country about what education was for, what it should look like, how it should be measured, how it should be monitored. But what you'll notice here is that although he was a Labour Prime Minister, the real influences in that conversation came from what were called the New Right. So this was a group of people coming from the opposite end of the political spectrum, from the political right, who had very different political views to Callaghan at the time, but were really influential in this great debate. They wrote some papers called the Black Papers, which tore apart the education system as it was and promoted new ideas. The New Right was made up of two different groups, and the one that we hear about most of all is the neoliberals. Okay, so these are really interested in free market capitalism. It's an economic ideal, but it played into education, as we will see. A kind of lesser heard voice at the time, but part of the New Right were the neoconservatives, whose name is exactly what it suggests. They are much more interested, although they submit to the free market, more interested in sort of conservative traditional values, and we'll come back to those later. But the point is, in identifying the problems in education, Callaghan opened up the door for this conversation, and the driving force from that came through from the New Right. And then by 1979, we had a conservative, so a more right-wing government anyway. And so they were then able to implement many of these ideals. They didn't do it quickly. The Conservative government came in under Margaret Thatcher in 1979. They did spend some time working through various issues in education, and it all came to a head in 1988. Just before we get to 1988, let's have a little look at what we understand by neoliberalism for the purposes of this conversation. And I realize if you're an economist, you would perhaps take a slightly more nuanced view of this, but this is the definition that I'm kind of comfortable with, the one that I use in my book, and the one that I think works for what we see going on in education at the moment. So free market ideology, as I've said, so small state, limited government control, small state that allows the market to decide for itself. That's the kind of way that it's phrased that doesn't involve any emotion, to say, well, the market will decide, and that seems very tidy and very neat, and not loaded in any way. What I like about this definition is it points out that it isn't the market that decides. The market doesn't decide anything. People do. People make decisions. The market might allow them to make choices, but the basis of neoliberalism is on self-interested actors. So people who are taking decisions that they think are in the best interests for them. Now, when that works through over the next 20 years, what we discover is that sometimes people that are in leadership positions in education take decisions that may not seem to be in the best interests of those they are educating, which may seem contradictory. In my view, it comes right down to this understanding of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is based on selfishness. So if you're going to be self-interested, you wouldn't be surprised to see that people make decisions that might suit them, but that don't necessarily suit the needs of learners more generally. So I think that it's important to hold that in the back of your mind as we just take our tour through what neoliberalism has done to schools. The idea of the market making decisions, you know, the invisible hand, as Adam Smith called it, the invisible hand of the market, it's not something that's entirely neutral. So these are the people who influenced government thinking through the 1980s and drove what culminated in the 1988 Education Reform Act. This is the most significant education act in England for 150 years, and we haven't had one since that's had the same significance as this. What it did was it did rationalize education, so we all started to talk in the same language. So prior to 1988, children in one end of the country, their school structure may have been quite different from children in another area of the country. So this did rationalize things. It did apply initially to England and Wales, and to a lesser degree, some aspects of it applied in Scotland and Northern Ireland. But you will have heard me say several times, I'm talking about education in England. The four home nations of the United Kingdom have different educational systems. And from this point on, England diverged much more away from the others than it had done before. So we are talking about England here. We're not talking about the UK. The 1988 Act introduced a number of things that were completely new. Now, it was 1988, it was 30 years ago. It was just before I started teaching in schools, and this is why it has a particular resonance for me, because this act was being implemented and we were seeing policy being enacted over the next decade, which was exactly when I started teaching. So, you know, I lived with these things being implemented in our schools. I lived through it. I watched as policy was being developed and then enacted in schools. And then obviously when I was a principal, I was very much involved in that implementation of policy. But what it means is that we've reached a point now where certainly children leaving school or leaving university, students leaving university, and most of our teachers have not known anything different from this. And one of the reasons why I like to work with international universities and talk to their students and their teachers is to help our students to understand everybody else doesn't necessarily do it like this. This isn't the only way. There's a whole lot of papers and books that have been written about neoliberalism being the only way. And it does seem to be sort of sweeping the Western world, certainly. But that doesn't mean that everybody's applied it to education in the way that it's been done in England. So I think it's really important for young people's eyes to be open, to help them to see you don't have to do it like this. This is how our policy has been decided, but other people do it in different ways. Nonetheless, we've had 30 years of it, and this is what people have got used to. And it may surprise some of them, it may surprise some of you to think that up until the 1980s, we didn't have some of these things. But it wasn't until 1988 that we had a national curriculum. So for the first time, it was laid down in law what children had to study in school, all the way from starting school right through to school leavers. The detail of the national curriculum was laid down across, I think it was 14 different subjects in the first instance, and through the different age phases. Things called key stages were defined, and these are age phases really. So key stage 1 is for children up to the age of 7. Key stage 2 goes up to the age of 11. Key stage 3 goes up to the age of 14, and key stage 4 goes up to the age of 16. Sometimes people talk about key stage 5, which goes up to 18. That wasn't in the original act. But what we'd started to do was to give people a language to say, look, these are the stages that children move through. And then to a degree, primary and secondary schools were reorganized to fit more neatly with the key stages. Then the curriculum also contained things that were called attainment targets. So this is what the expectation was for a child at the end of each key stage. So you could say the attainment targets in, say, mathematics would show what maths a 7-year-old child would know when they get to the end of key stage 2, and what they should be able to do, what they should be able to achieve. So those targets, they were quite ambitious and they were extremely detailed. But what they allowed for then was for schools to be measured, because you could then look at a school and say, well, how many of your 7-year-olds achieved the mathematics targets by the end of key stage 2? How many 14-year-olds achieved the targets in science by the end of key stage 3, and so on. So it now enabled you to measure schools for the first time and compare one school with another. And that, as we will see, is really important for neoliberalism. Work was done on admissions, and the 1988 Act took away the old admissions processes for schools. And they basically, so what had happened before this is that you would probably go to your nearest school, and we have the country is split up into local authority areas, which is like local government. Those local authorities would decide which school children went to, but basically school nearest home is where you're most likely to go up until 1988. This was turned on its head by the 1988 Act, which said, no, admissions aren't going to work like that. What's going to happen is parents will say, I'd like my child to go to this school, and then we'll have some policies that work out which ones end up in which school. So it put admissions into the hands of the parents. Again, as we'll see in a minute, really important for neoliberalism. And then something which these days when I talk to school leaders, they're amazed at how things used to be before this, but local management of schools was put into place. Now, what this means is extremely local. So in other words, the principal, the head teacher, the leader of the school suddenly became responsible for the budget, for hire and fire, employing people, for the estate, for managing all the buildings, a whole load of things that prior to that, these were all managed at a distance by the local authority. So when I first applied for a teaching job, I applied to a local authority, to what they called a pool, and then they would then take people who were successful from the pool, and they would place them in various schools across the area. So you didn't apply to a particular school, you didn't know which school it would be. The local authority would put you into a school. 1988 changed that so that applicants would apply to a school, they'd be employed by that school, and the school would be responsible for all the issues that sit around employment. Now that's a big difference from head teachers who were once just responsible for teaching and learning in their schools and discipline and that kind of thing, to suddenly be responsible for money and people and resources. Probably, I would say, it gave them much more freedom than they had before. But I would imagine, you know, I wasn't a principal in 1988, but I would imagine for some of them that was a little bit scary to suddenly take that on for the first time. It's something now that we've very much got used to, and people are much more trained to be able to lead people, employ people, manage money, and so on. But certainly at the time, that was really, really significant. And then one other thing which I'll just mention, which wasn't built into 1988, it came a couple of years later in 1992, was in the 1992 Act, Ofsted were introduced. Now, Ofsted is our inspection, our inspectorate. They are there to regulate schools, to monitor schools. Initially it was schools. Now it's all education providers, so universities as well. We had them visit about a month ago. Ofsted are, I think, have a certain reputation, certainly nationally, and I think internationally as well. They claim that they help education providers to improve. What they actually do, they don't do any improvement work. They only come in and make judgments. So they will walk in, say, this is good, this is weak, this needs strengthening, this could be improved, and then they walk away again. They don't do any work to actually help an institution to get better. But it was the first time this had happened, you know, from 1992 onwards, and it was a real shock to the system. Partly because they uncovered some practices which weren't great, if we're honest. You know, nothing was perfect beforehand, but also partly because of the kind of language that they used. So they talked about failing schools. They talked about teachers who were inadequate in the classroom, and that was a shock, you can imagine, to teaching unions, to school leaders who had, you know, perhaps quite a cozy environment, to suddenly be challenged from the outside. And that was also, it's also something that's quite important in the neoliberal conversation. So these things all came in for the first time in 1988. Well, the Act was 1988. You can imagine it took a few years for some of them to be implemented. But over the next 4 or 5 years, these came into place in schools, and they made an immediate difference. So I've already said the national curriculum brought about consistency. We now knew what was being taught, and incidentally the examinations changed as well, so that these were consistent across the country too. So we now knew what was being taught to children wherever they went to school, and we knew what the contents were of each subject. We knew how they were examined, and so you knew if someone had got a grade A from a school in London and someone got a grade A from a school in Nottingham, you knew that they'd covered the same thing and they'd reached the same standard. So it did bring about a consistency that we hadn't had before. But it also allowed for comparability, as I've said. Now that schools in particular were being measured through the attainment targets and progress towards the end of each of the key stages, what that meant was you could now compare one school with another. So you could look at groups of children in two different schools and say, well, in this school, 50% have reached the attainment target, but in this school, 70% have reached the attainment target. So that might give you a way to compare schools. And this is where it becomes important to neoliberalism, because what that does is it enables the consumers, and we start to use that language now, to have some choice. So prior to this, parents wouldn't have been able to choose which school to send their children to anyway, and B, even if they could choose, they had no data on which to base a decision. And the argument is that by measuring schools in this way, by providing a consistency of what children are studying and then being able to compare how well children have performed, you can then make an informed choice about which schools to send your children to. So that was the real, the neoliberal driver there, is to say that parents are consumers, and this sort of language was used politically. If a school is weak, parents won't send their children there, so then that school basically will close. Okay. What it overlooked was the fact that if a school is really strong, however that's measured, but if it's perceived to be strong and lots of parents want to send their children to that school, it won't be able to grow very much beyond its local footprint, and therefore not all of the children will get in. And so you'll still need the weaker school down the road, and what you really need is that weaker school to improve, not to close. But it gave the impression that parents would have choice. The reality of that is, for good schools and for oversubscribed schools, the schools still choose. So they'll have lots of people trying to send their children there. The school will have to come up with a policy that enables them to choose which children get in and which ones don't. And then sadly, and this, for me, this is an important driver in terms of equity. Usually the people that lose out in those sort of competitions are those who are socially and economically disadvantaged in the first place. So what you find is that the wealthy and the articulate are able to get their children into the best schools, while others seem to suffer. And that doesn't seem to be very fair, but it seemed to be an outcome of this. And you can put all sorts of things into place to try and make that better. And various governments have tried to do that, but it hasn't really made a huge amount of difference, because ultimately, if you can afford to put your child in a car to drive them to a distant school, or if you can afford to move house to get in closer to a certain school, then you're at an advantage. So it didn't really resolve the problem that there might be children going to schools that are less good than others. It did provide a bit of a lever to help to improve some of those weaker schools, but not, I think, in the way that the government had originally envisaged. Then, of course, on top of this, to add to the information that the parents have, the Ofsted inspections, they're all made public. So Ofsted would write a long report and give a school a grade, and enable parents to have more information there, which was also there to inform their choice of schools. And that very much works out in practice. So when my children were small, I live in a little village, and the school here, it had an Ofsted grade of good. Ofsted give 4 grades. The highest one is outstanding, the next one is good. So the village school had a grade of good. In our nearby town, one of the schools had an outstanding grade. And when my children went to school and we sent them to the nearby village school, some of our neighbours said, "Oh, why don't you send them to the outstanding school, in town?" And my view was, do I really want to put them in a car every day and drive past a school that's actually good enough, and very good in lots of different ways? Do I want to do that just to get to one that has a particular label that these inspectors have given it? Now, we chose not to do that, but many people would choose to do it, and that contributed to some real difficulties with some oversubscribed schools and then others that didn't have enough children. So it's, parents do make that choice, and they do have those playground conversations. So I guess neoliberalism has worked to that that extent, in that it's given them information and they can make decisions. Some of us would question how useful the information is that they've got and the basis on which they're making those decisions. So that was 1988. The important thing to understand, that was Conservative government, as I've said. So was 1992. By 1997, we had a Labour government again. And this was the chance for things to go in a different direction. And I think some people thought when Labour came in that they would change education policy and that the direction would change, but it didn't. So Tony Blair said, no, we're going to carry on in the same direction here. And that's why for 30 years we've had a neoliberal agenda. So it survived the Labour government of 1997 through to 2010, when we had a coalition government who continued neoliberal policy, and then 2015 back to Conservative government again. So as you'd expect, this sort of policy would continue from them, and in fact from then became more neoconservative, as we'll see in a moment. So this was really, really significant and long lasting. You know, it's been 30 however many years now, 34 years, and I see no sign of it ending. Occasionally there are kind of optimists who say, oh, it's all changing, but actually it doesn't seem to be. And there's no suggestion that whichever party gets in our next election, there's no suggestion that it would change really. So that's very long lasting. The fact that schools are now being compared and that people are making choices about where to send their children, that really raises the stakes if you're a school leader. So suddenly accountability is really important, not just in terms of has public money been spent well and our children being educated well, but real accountability that comes down to people essentially retaining or losing their jobs. If your school appears to be failing and you're the school leader, you might expect to lose your job. And it's as black and white and as stark as that, and it can be overnight. So a school can be doing well one day, the next day have an inspection, and the day after that their leader has gone. It also meant that schools worked hard to make sure that whatever measures of the day were, and these have changed slightly over the 30 years, but schools worked hard to make sure that they appear to be performing well against the current metrics. Okay, and although I keep saying schools, bear in mind we're going to come back to HE later, and this applies to universities as well. So you end up with what Lyotard back in the 1970s called performativity. Our politicians call it gaming the system. But performativity is basically making sure that you are seen to perform in a way that is successful against whatever metrics are being used. So for me, it has less integrity than trying to do something well because there's real good reasons for doing it well. And it feels a bit like jumping through hoops. But we absolutely saw this happen in England schools, especially in the early days. So in the 1990s, there were all sorts of little tricks that schools could do that would make sure they would appear to be performing well. And what the newspapers really like, and I guess parents to a degree, is the fact that now that you can compare schools, you can put them in an order and say, well, these are the better schools, these ones seem to be struggling, these are, the newspapers really like to say, these are the 10 worst schools in the country. So they're putting schools into a league table. And we know that happens with universities as well. Okay, and I've shown you some of the awards that Nottingham Trent has won. We're not immune to playing that game. Personally, I don't like it. But, you know, that's what our leaders do. And they like to see that their school or their university is at the top of the league tables. And that, to me, undermines the argument of saying, but hold on a minute, some of these metrics are not very good. I think if you're going to have that argument, then you also have to say, so therefore we're not going to play the league table game. But league tables became really, really important because the argument was they helped people to make choices about which were the best schools. So performativity became a theme, certainly in England's education system from the sort of mid-1990s, as people learned how to push their institution towards the top of the league tables. So I did tell you that we would think about curriculum. So I'm just going to start off this with a little quote. This comes from Amanda Spielman, who is currently our Chief Inspector, Her Majesty's His Majesty's Chief Inspector of Education. So the leader of Ofsted, national leader of Ofsted. And what she said, this was a few years ago, she said that sometimes we lose sight of the substance of education. And by substance of education, what she meant was the curriculum, what it is that people study. And she said to understand the substance of education, we have to understand the objectives. So I'm just going to take a pause here. I've talked for quite a long time. Just going to take a pause here and let me see if I can come out of. Okay, so the substance of education is the curriculum. In order to design a curriculum, I think it's generally accepted that you need to understand what the curriculum is for. So I just wanted to ask a question and just take a few views to say, well, what is the purpose of the curriculum? I think I know what it is, and I know what it is politically in England, but I don't know about Malaysia context. So what is the purpose of education? Basically, that's a really wide question, but I'd be really interested in just 2 or 3 comments if people can either put them up on screen, or I don't know if they can speak, to say what is the purpose of education? What would you define it as in Malaysia?
All right, Chris. For me, education is a long process actually, where the most important is what we actually as educator we plan for the students, and at the end of the day, what actually the student get from what we have teach or plan for them. In a simple word. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. There's some appearing in the comments now as well. So one about early childhood, which is talks about holistic aspects of development. Purpose of education is to enable a person to think critically and creatively. Okay. Okay, there's one here about developing Malaysian citizens who are knowledgeable and competent with high moral standards, responsible and capable of achieving a high level of personal well-being, contributing to the harmony and betterment of the family, the society, and the nation at large. Okay, that's enough to give me what I want, to give me a flavour. So in what I've just heard and what I've just read there, liberate minds and action of a person, enable people to develop their full potential. So these are all around the holistic development of a person. Okay, now that's really interesting that that's spontaneously come from all of you. If you were to ask the same question in England, most people would say it's about employment and it's about the economy. So education is so that people can be employed and get a job, and education is so that people can contribute to the economy of the nation. Very different from what you've just said there. So let me just come back to, so this is where we were. This was the beginning of Amanda Spielman's quote. She went on to say this. Education has to prepare young people to succeed in life and make their contribution to the labour market. But if that's all education is about, then it's a bit wretched. So the prevailing political view is education is about supporting the nation's economy. It's about getting people into work. This is really important for universities. We'll come back to this later. Okay. So this is someone who within the establishment, she's leader of Ofsted, but she's actually challenging the view that education is just about getting a job. And what I've just heard from Malaysia is that you have a much more refreshing view than this. It's quite nice to see what your own view is there. She made a final comment in this, and she said it should be about broadening minds, enriching communities, and advancing civilization. Ultimately, and I really like this bit, it's about leaving the world a better place than we found it. So in order to design a curriculum, we need to understand purpose. If our purpose is just to provide people for a labour market, we're going to have a different sort of curriculum than if it's actually to enrich communities and to leave the world a better place. So again, something to hold on to as we come back and have a look at the detail of curriculum in a moment. I kind of characterize this with 5 E's really. So initially, our politicians in particular are talking about employment and economy. The purpose of education is about employment and economy. Now, I would I would say those things are important, but I'd add 3 more E's to those as well. I think it's about enlightenment. So this is what Amanda Spielman calls broadening minds. I think it's about enrichment. She talks there about enriching community. And I think, and this comes back to my early slide, the one that you didn't see very well, it's about emancipation. It's about giving people freedom through the qualifications they get, through the things they learn at school, through what they understand about relationships, but giving them a freedom that they might not have had without education. So those 5 E's are important to me in terms of curriculum, but in terms of the neoliberal agenda, it's just the first 2, employment and economy. Of course, those first 2 things that we just talked about, how many children get a job, how many young people leaving our universities find work, they're really easy to measure. If I'm talking about enlightenment or enrichment, that's really hard to measure. So again, it doesn't sit comfortably with neoliberalism that wants to be able to measure in order to compare. So I guess I'm revealing there, my own sort of personal views on this, but some of it is borne out by what Amanda Spielman said 5 years ago in 2017. I think that just thinking about the labour market is not enough. So the principles of the curriculum here in England are these. The first 3 are the ones which are always quoted. The curriculum is supposed to be broad and balanced. So young people in schools should study a wide range of subjects, and it should be balanced. So there shouldn't be too much emphasis on one subject over and above another. It should be coherent, so both across a space of time and also geographically, we need coherence. If someone moves from one area of the country to another, they should be able to drop back into education and pick up from where they left off. And as they go through from being 3 years old, and we do have a curriculum for 3-year-olds, all the way through to 19, there should be a coherence in their learning as they go through as well. And as I've really stressed, accountability through benchmarking. So you should be able to see from the curriculum, this is what people should have learnt about. And if they haven't done, then there is an accountability system that comes back to the leadership to say, well, why haven't they reached these benchmarks? Those are the key things that are always quoted. Tucked away in the detail of curriculum policy in England are these other 2 bullet points. The curriculum should also promote spiritual, cultural, mental and physical development, which is more along the lines of what some of you have just talked about in terms of the purpose of education. And then also preparing people for opportunities, responsibilities and experiences of adulthood. That's how it's phrased. I would interpret that fairly broadly, but I think it's comfortable for some people to interpret that much more narrowly and basically say prepares them for work. No, it doesn't say prepares them for work. It says more than that. But nonetheless, that's the way that particular bullet point is frequently interpreted. And again, this has application to universities and university pedagogy, as we'll see later on. So those are the principles. The English national curriculum is measured in accountability like this. And the reason for showing you this is because it drives what happens in the classroom. So an English school is measured on 2 measures. One is called Progress 8 and one is called EBAC. So Progress 8 looks at how well young people have done across 8 qualifications. English and maths, and we call these buckets sometimes. And English and maths, you can see that the buckets are bigger than the other buckets. And that's because although they only get 1 qualification in each, it's double counted in the measure. So you might question about the balance that I just talked about in terms of the principle of the curriculum, but English and maths nonetheless have a double measure. Then the green buckets, which have a very specific range of qualifications in science, computer science, geography, history, and a modern language. That's all that's allowed in the green buckets. And then the open group, which in theory you can have anything in your other orange buckets. So you might have a whole range of different qualifications in there, but I just need to draw your attention to one word. Okay, they have to be approved qualifications. So suddenly it isn't anything, It's only approved qualifications. And the EBAC measure completely ignores the orange buckets anyway. Then what this means is, I think, that that principle of a broad and balanced curriculum is now compromised. This is how schools are going to be measured. So what are schools going to put their emphasis on? They can't afford to spend too much time on the orange buckets because they clearly need to perform well on English, maths, and the other EBAC subjects. So that means that there's a real emphasis on what in England would have been traditional, old-fashioned academic subjects: English, maths, science, languages, and history and geography. So where is the place for somebody who, I don't know, might want to be a car mechanic, or who might want to go into health and social care? Because although you can teach those sorts of subjects in schools, they're not even approved for the orange buckets. So they don't get counted at all in your accountability curriculum. So therefore, hardly any schools will teach those sorts of subjects. And by those sorts of subjects, I'm usually meaning something that's quite vocational or something that's quite applied. So it means that there's a real emphasis on academic learning over applied, and we'll come back to this shortly. Bottom line is there's a real tension here between what you're held accountable for and the curriculum that you might want to provide in your establishment. And certainly when I was a school leader, this was a real difficulty because I wanted to do more around some of the sorts of things that you've talked about, more around arts, more around vocational provision. And you know, that if we were lucky, that would fit into the orange buckets. But if it didn't, then basically it just wasn't worth doing because it would be criticised, and we would be saying, people would be saying to us, well, why aren't you spending more time on your EBAC qualifications and English and maths? So it creates a tension. In terms of inside the subjects, what is going on? Well, what we know, this has always been true, is that basically people will teach to the test. The system will always privilege what's going to be examined over other expressions of knowledge. So you will always end up having to make sure that you've taught what's going to be in the exam at the end. So that does narrow the curriculum sometimes. This was heightened in 2013 by changes to the curriculum across the country, which moved it in the directions that I've just said. So it took a broad curriculum. So this is now not in terms of subject, but inside a subject, inside each subject. So history, for example, which used to be quite broad, might look at international history. It was narrowed down. It focused much more on the history of our nation, and was much narrower than it would have been before. The curriculum was also changed so that where there was opportunity to do what you might call a spiral curriculum, which is where you visit something, you learn more about a variety of things, and then you come back and you learn about it in greater depth in that spiral curriculum. The curriculum became much more linear. So the view in Westminster, political view, I think a naive view, was that you study this thing, whatever it might be, within your subject on Tuesday of this week, and then that's it, done. You know it. And you move on, and you don't need to come back and revisit it. That seems a little naive to me, but nonetheless, that's the direction in which the curriculum was moved. It moved from the general to quite specific, and so within subjects, very specific examples were given about what people have to learn. And so the opportunity for teachers to design their curriculum within a general sense of direction was taken away. There was certainly a move away from skills towards knowledge, and away from aptitudes towards content. So less about are you able to do this, and more about do you know this content. And as I've already said, a movement away from applied and towards more academic learning. And that was kind of formally done through a change to the curriculum from 2013 onwards. You could summarize that really, and people do. They call it a knowledge-based curriculum. And some people are very proud of that and think it's very important that we have a knowledge-based curriculum. Others would question at least some of it. And some people would challenge it altogether, I guess. Really, really different. I was talking to some colleagues in Kenya where they have moved very deliberately, very purposely, they've moved towards a competency-based curriculum. So almost the exact opposite of what I'm talking about here. And this is what I mean about working with young people in our schools and universities and saying to them, just because you've been through a knowledge-based curriculum and you feel that that was successful and you've learned a lot from it, doesn't mean there aren't other ways of doing it. And to look at a competency-based curriculum might be a really interesting academic exercise, or it might be more than that. It might be something that actually makes people think and want to challenge what they see here. So, so curriculum reform from 2013 took the national curriculum as it was and just reshaped it a bit. And this is very much influenced, I think, by the neoconservatives. So that changes the curriculum that people are teaching. And of course, if you look at what I've just said there, that also is going to change the pedagogy, which is what we'll come back to shortly. So having said that this is influenced by neoconservatives, I probably ought to say, let's just check that we understand what we mean by neoconservatism. And if you look this up in a book or you Google it, you will see neoconservatism expressed, again, like neoliberalism, in terms of economics and how a country is led. In terms of education, you need to unpick that a little bit. And this is my understanding of it. And I want to be clear that this is my definition, not someone else's, because you've already gathered that I have a particular view about some of our policies. So this may not be an entirely unbiased definition, I suppose it would be fair to say. But, you know, neoconservatives, by their title, you can see they're going to reject permissive liberal values. The difference between the neocons and the neoliberals is that here they want strong central state leadership. So the neoliberalism was a weak state because discipline came from the market. Here, the neocons are saying, no, you need to have strong central discipline. This becomes important in pedagogy, okay? So you need to have strong centralized discipline. And then within that framework, you can then have basic traditional structures, systems of authority, but allow the free market to work. So the free market will work within those structures and within a framework that is centralized. Just put this final point in, it doesn't really play into education too much. Foreign policy has a nationalistic flavor. I'll give you an example of that. So our current teacher training qualification, QTS it's called, Qualified Teacher Status, which we run in the UK. The government says, well, you know, there are various other countries around the world that might want to learn to teach in the way that we do. So we could offer QTS internationally. So for the last 2 years, they've started to offer QTS around the world. In order to get qualified teacher status here, you have to have an understanding and be able to teach something which is called fundamental British values. Many of us would argue those values are not British, they're just values. But the government says fundamental British values are really important. So you might then question, well, if we're going to market QTS internationally, let's say we do it in Malaysia, let's offer QTS to teachers in Malaysia. What right do we have to say to teachers they need to be able to teach fundamental British values? That's built into our international QTS offer, not ours. We don't do this at NTU. We decided not to, but it, you know, this is what our government offers. To me, this smacks of a kind of colonialism, a kind of empire building, which I had thought we were trying to move away from. You know, and I know Johannes and I have had many conversations about our PGCHE offer, which we have to try to develop the teaching skills of partner organisations, both in the UK and internationally. But our approach, NTU approach to doing that, is to say, how do we develop your teaching skills within your context, within your national context, within your national policies, within your understanding of what education is for? How do we develop teaching skills? How do we develop pedagogy in the classroom? So not to impose, a neoconservative view, not to say how we do it in England is the right way. Now let's help you to do it the English way over there. That's absolutely not what we're about. But that is what the neoconservative view is. And that is what you will see if you look at people that are offering the English TS internationally. So that's an understanding of neoconservatism. That's taken us through curriculum. And we will, I promise you, move on to pedagogy in a moment. But before we do that, as I promised, we have an option for anybody to ask any questions at this stage or make any comments.
There's one underneath.
Okay, that's a really interesting question. What's the philosophy behind competency-based curriculum versus knowledge-based curriculum? So I have just applied for some money to ask exactly that question. Having spoken to colleagues in Kenya about their competency-based curriculum, I really want to research that. That's a really good research question that I want to have a look at. I guess the answer, the policy answer here is that here we've now got the neoconservative view, which says you need to understand content before you can apply skills. Okay, and I'll give you an example of this shortly, actually. I think there is an argument to say if you don't understand the substance, then you can't apply skills. But I don't think competency-based curriculum negates that. And to me, only knowing the knowledge and not having the skills leaves you falling short. So I think there's an argument for competency-based curriculum. Knowledge-based, I think the real argument there is it's easy to measure. You can see if somebody knows something or if they don't, and you can very easily prescribe this is the knowledge that you need to have in order to do X, Y, Z. I think there's probably deeper philosophy behind that around, you know, the understanding of the purpose of education. And if you want people to develop potential, if you want them to be liberated, then you need to give them competencies to be able to do that, I would argue. But if the purpose of your curriculum is about economics and getting people into jobs, then you might come at that from a different angle. Training and learning compared to teaching and learning. Does it have to do with the generation gap? I don't think it's necessarily to do with age, but I do think we are creating a generation gap because of what I've just said. We have now a whole generation of people who've only known knowledge-based curriculum, who've only known neoliberalism, who've only known the idea that education is about contributing to the economy. And that worries me because then they're less likely to question it. So I think there is a generation difference, but it's not because of age. It's just because some of us have experienced different approaches to education and therefore might be more open to thinking about that. And that's why in my teaching, I always want young people to see there are other ways of doing things. So yeah, I think there may be something to do with that. The issue around training, we're going to come back to this as we look at higher education in a later slide. So the issue around training, I think, is important because you might argue that, well, if it's about training, that's more about competency than about knowledge. So that has a particular application in England anyway to higher education and to universities. So we will come back to that. Okay, shall I pop the slides back up and we'll carry on? There we go. So let's start to think about pedagogy. So I don't know if, I've just put the slides back up, so I can't see the chat, but maybe people could shout out. So this is a question. What is your understanding of pedagogy? Because, you know, we're going to talk about it, but I think we need to understand what it is, what we're talking about. The art of teaching. Okay, I like that one. We'll come back to that. And this is when we do our PGCHE here in NTU, and all of our lecturers have to have that qualification. So they have to have done some work around understanding what pedagogy is. It's a challenge for some of them. So if you've done a first degree in physics, as I did, do your PhD in astrophysics, do your postdoc, and then suddenly you're in front of a group of undergraduates teaching your subject, you may not have thought about what pedagogy is at all. So it is a challenge for some people. So, right, we've got art of teaching, method and practice of teaching, approaches of delivering information, okay, ways and means of delivering. So delivering is coming up twice. how to teach, approaches in teaching, the way you conduct your teaching. Okay, they're really interesting, especially the delivering. You know, I think if you think that your curriculum is around knowledge, then you might think about delivering. If you think your curriculum is around skills, then the word delivering you might struggle with that, because you might do it in a different way. So methods of teaching, the way you conduct your teaching. Right, let me share with you the definition that I like. Although I've asked you this question and I've got some great answers there, this is a question that has been asked for thousands of years. Okay, so you go back to the ancient Greeks and to Plutarch, who talked about, is education and pedagogy, is it about filling the bottle? So does the pupil, the child, the student, is it an empty bottle that you're trying to fill up with a certain amount of knowledge? And this is where the delivery model might work. Alternatively, you might say, well, is it about developing skills? So is it like sharpening the blade of a knife? Is that what pedagogy is? It's how you sharpen those individual blades and help them to go out into the world sharper than they were when they came in. Or is it, as Plutarch said, more like kindling a flame? Is it about igniting something in somebody which then goes on to grow and to spread and get hotter and more violent? And I think you can argue for all of those, for each of them, or you might argue that it's a combination of those. You know, the one that appeals to me, you might have guessed by now, is the lighting the fire. I want to get people excited about education, and I want my pedagogy to do that. I recognize as a physicist, it's really important that there's certain knowledge they have. So I need to transfer that to them and fill that bottle. But also, as a physicist, I know that they need certain skills to be able to do that. They can't use their physics without a certain amount of maths, for example. So sharpening the blade is quite important. We'll come back to those three things, but here's the definition that I find works well. So somebody said pedagogy is the art of teaching. This definition by Robin Alexander, it says it's the act of teaching, together with the attendant discourse of educational theories, values, evidence, and justifications. And that second part is really important. It isn't just about what you do, the act of teaching. You need the discourse that goes around it, because it's also about why you do it. So, you know, it's very easy to think, I have this knowledge here, but I've got to transfer to my students, so then they all have it. So I'll stand at the front and I'll talk, and then they'll all know it. And it doesn't take you very long to realize, actually, I need to think a bit more carefully than that. It isn't just about standing at the front and telling them some stuff. There's more to teaching than that. So then thinking about why you do things and how you do it, the discourse of theory, values, and evidence is really important. And that's part of pedagogy as well. And I think those two together, you might say, has to do with the art of teaching. It then becomes more of an art rather than just something that's an act, which might be a technical activity. We'll come back to that. So I like this definition. I think it's a good one. It's about what you need to know and the skills you need to command in order to make and justify different kinds of decision, of which teaching is contributed. So let's look again at that last little bit. It's about decision making. Okay, teaching is about decision making. Here is a thing that I need my students to learn. I have to make a decision about the best way to approach this so that they can learn in the best way. Lots of decision making, especially in schools, loads of decisions, minute by minute decisions, in particular around discipline and managing the classroom. And this person has said that. How am I going to respond to this? This person has done that. How am I going to respond to this? How am I going to make sure that everybody in the room continues to learn? Oh, we've got a worldwide pandemic. Now everybody's at home. Pedagogy has to do with thinking about how are we going to make sure they can still learn, even though we're doing it not in the same room. So pedagogy is, it might be described as an art, but within art, you have to make decisions about the tools and the materials that you're going to use, the way that you're going to use them, the way that you combine things. So I think pedagogy is about decision making. And because of that, pedagogy feels really personal. This is about you as a lecturer in your lecture theatre, as someone leading a seminar in a seminar room with 24 students, as a primary teacher in a classroom with their children. That's your space. You're making the decisions in that space. And this is your personal pedagogy. Some of it you will have decided before you walked into the room because it will have been in your lesson plan. Some of it you have to decide on the hoof, always, because you don't know what's going to happen in that room. You know, someone makes an inappropriate comment or a really, really valid question that actually wasn't to do with what you're going to teach about. And then you have to make those personal decisions. But of course, none of us works individually. We all work inside a bigger organization. And just because I like the things to begin with P, I've called this parochial, but the kind of institutional approach has an effect here. So for example, at NTU, as soon as we could, after the pandemic had died down a bit and people were getting vaccinations, as soon as we could, the university approach was back to face-to-face teaching, back in the room, unless there's a really good reason not to. Some people personally didn't feel that that was right. They would have preferred to carry on online for a bit longer. They didn't feel safe or secure in a classroom and so on. But they had to subscribe to the university view, which is always face-to-face unless there's a good reason not to. So you have to work within your local structures and your local ethos there. And it's exactly the same in schools. And you will know that you can walk into another university or another school and it has a different feel about it. The whole ethos is a bit different. And that affects the pedagogy of people in their classrooms. So it's not simply personal. It also is influenced by the place that you work. And then, of course, and you knew this was coming, it's also political. You know, what is happening in your classroom today and the way that you teach might be influenced by national policy. It certainly will be in England if you're teaching national curriculum for the reasons that we've just seen. So it feels personal, and it is personal, but it's influenced by your institution and by broader policy. And of course, we don't have time to go into this. Policy is quite a big thing to understand. Mostly today, I'm talking about policy in terms of national policy. But of course, you have local policy within your institution, and you'll have very local policy that might be within your classroom. You know, most of us in our pedagogy, when we go in, I always say to my students at the beginning of a module, right, this is how we're going to work. These are my expectations. This is what happens in my teaching sessions. This is what I expect of you. So there are, you know, very local policies that are just around the personal. But mostly today we're talking about policy as in the political, the national political. And what that means is, for us here in England, what happens in Westminster affects what happens in my classroom. Sometimes that's uncomfortable. Policy affects practice. And that's one of the things that I'm really interested in terms of my own research, is that policy practice interface. Here in England, quite a lot has been written about the fact that from the 1980s through to the early 2000s, there's completely unprecedented central intervention from that Westminster conversation affecting what happens in our classrooms, in schools, colleges, universities. Completely unprecedented, never happened before 1988. The reason why people say 1980s to early 2000s is not because it stopped, but because it's continuing now. But now, 30 years later, we've kind of got used to it. So it's not a new thing anymore. And we're used to the idea that somebody makes a decision in Westminster and the next day, what we're doing in our classrooms might have to change. So that's the norm here in England. It may not be in Malaysia. I know it certainly isn't in some other countries around the world. In terms of our definition and understanding of pedagogy, you might think about that as how we teach stuff. So you might have expected nationally for the curriculum what we teach to be set, but you might then expect us to be allowed to think by ourselves about how we teach it. And that's what's changing. The what has been there for 30 years, the last 10, 15 years, they're now starting to tell us how it has to be done. That used to be professional choice. So that decision making used to be professional choice. Some of us would say that that professional discretion is being removed, but it was predictable, and you could see it coming. So in 1992, going back 30 years, 1992, even then, we were starting to see that the notion of a teacher as a facilitator of learning, as someone who supported learning, was being challenged and being replaced. And none of you used this word, but it's certainly used a lot in America. It was being replaced by instructor. So there's lots in America about teaching and pedagogy as instruction. And interesting to see that none of you put that in the chat. I find that quite reassuring, so I'm quite pleased by that. But you know, it's a direction in which pedagogy is moving, and we'll see a bit more of that in the next couple of slides. So policy in the classroom. These are some examples of specific government policies that made a difference to how people teach in their classroom. 1998 and 99, we saw two things happen. One was called the literacy and numeracy hours. So this is where central government said in every primary school up and down the country, you have to have at least 1 hour in the morning on literacy and 1 hour in the morning on numeracy. And within that hour, they also specified what they had to do. So you had to do 20 minutes of reading together in literacy and 20 minutes of group reading, and then a written task. Numeracy, you had to do some mental arithmetic and then some written tasks. So absolutely specified by the government what you have to do in that hour and what time of day it had to be, and it had to be every day. Now that stipulation has gone, but that's still what we see in schools. So most primary schools now are doing literacy and numeracy every morning, and usually for more than an hour. But that has remained. The other thing that came in through a thing called the National Strategy in 1999 was a 3-part lesson plan where the government was saying, we expect to see lessons of about an hour broken down into 3 parts: a starter, a main activity, and then a plenary, which a slightly sort of crass description of that would be telling them what they're going to learn, teaching them it, and then testing to see if they've learned it. Those 3 parts. Although they said it's not a mechanistic recipe to be followed, the Ofsted inspection framework would criticize you if you did not do that. That was 1999. Today, I would say people are still trying to stick to 3-part lessons because somebody in Westminster said that's what a good lesson looks like. You can move beyond that, but it's risky. And at the time, you know, there were 2 problems if you move beyond it. One is if you don't do what somebody else has said, then you've got to spend some time creating your own lesson plan and your own structure and so on. And then 2 is if someone comes and looks at that, if you're observed by Ofsted or maybe observers within your own institution, then it better be good. It has to be better than the 3-part lesson. Otherwise they would say, well, why don't you just do what you've been told to do? So it's risky not to do that. It's always easier to follow the example that you've been given centrally than to create your own and then make sure that that's justified. If you just stick to what you've been told to do, then you're very obviously compliant with policy, and that can be much more straightforward. So that was a very direct government saying this is what happens in class to happen in classrooms. Same sort of thing happened in 2010, and there was a lead up to this. But from 2010, schools had to make sure that young children learnt how to read through a system called systematic synthetic phonics. There are other systems. There was an American study which showed that systematic systems, unsurprisingly perhaps, were better than random systems. So if you had a systematic program that helped people to learn gradually more complex words, then that was a good way of learning to read. Synthetic phonics has to do with breaking a word up into little bits, learning the bits and then putting them together, synthesizing them to understand what the whole word is. It's not the only way of doing phonics. You can do analytical phonics, which works in a different way, and which the American paper showed, as long as it was done systematically, was equally as good as synthetic phonics. However, our government settled on systematic synthetic phonics and insisted that this has to be the way that children learn. So that changed people's pedagogy. If they were using other methods, even other systematic methods, they have to use this one. Initially, it was strongly encouraged. And of course, the inspectors would come in and basically, if they didn't see that, they wanted to see something that was better. But then it actually became enforced. So by 2012, there was a deliberate check to make sure that systematic synthetic phonics was being used. And by 2012 as well, the qualified teacher status that I talked about, teacher standards, to be a qualified teacher, you have to have demonstrated that you can teach systematic synthetic phonics. So that is very direct government policy defining what your pedagogy looks like. Even though, as we can see in this quote from Clark, there may not have been the strength of evidence which the government thought there was. You know, there is some evidence, well, there is evidence to show systematic synthetic phonics is effective in teaching reading. There's evidence to show that other systematic methods are equally good, but they're ignored by the politicians. So you can see here, politicians, they dictate not just what should be taught, but also how it must be taught. And we will see, I think this is creeping into university teaching as well. Backed by an accountability regime which forces people to adhere to the policies, even if they've got concerns in their professional judgment. And coming back to that generational thing, so what I discover with younger teachers is they don't have concerns because they don't have the knowledge to be able to make professional judgment. So they're just doing synthetic phonics because they know that's what you have to do. Older teachers that have used a variety of different mechanisms have more concerns because they understand that you need to look at what the evidence is, and they recognise that although there's evidence for SSP, there's evidence for other things too, and therefore they might want to use professional judgment that will take them in a different direction. So that then causes a conflict within your teachers. Stephen Ball wrote a seminal paper about 20 years ago, which talked about performativity as the terror of the teacher's soul. And this is where you see it happening, when your own professional judgment tells you that you want to go in one direction, but policy says you have to go in another. And in order to be seen to be performing against that policy, you have to go in a different direction. And that can be a challenge. So I said, pedagogy is not just the act of teaching, but that art of teaching that includes understanding why you're doing stuff. And if you're going to understand why you're teaching, then you need to have some understanding of some theories of learning. There are lots of theories of learning. They're not all on here. Okay, this isn't exclusive. I'm just using a few here because they're relevant to our particular political circumstances. So the simplest theory might come up with is John Locke's tabula rasa, which says the mind is a blank slate. This is the filling the bottle. Okay, the mind is a blank slate. The job of the teacher and pedagogy involves taking what the teacher knows and putting it onto that slate of the pupil, the student. Obviously, that immediately breaks down because the next day when you go and teach that student, the slate's not blank anymore because they learned some stuff yesterday. So it's not quite as simple as it might appear to be, and that takes us into constructivism, which is where you're constructing reality on the basis of some of the things that you already know. So you build on what you already know. You can do that all by yourself through an autodidactic approach. And if you want to read about that, then I would recommend that you go back a few centuries and look at Rousseau's Emile, where Emile is kind of the perfect autodidact, the young child who asks questions, who builds his own knowledge with an adult as mentor. Or constructivism, can work in groups and together, and you work your way towards social constructivism, which we're all familiar with, Vygotsky's work. Not that it's completely random and and just kind of exploring in random different directions and building knowledge in that way, because according to Vygotsky, you have the more knowledgeable other. In other words, the teacher, the lecturer, who is leading you and guiding you through, so that you construct knowledge together. And social constructivism, I would say, is probably at the root of some of the child-centered education theories that you would see and practices that you might see around, but is one of the things that people were rebelling against here in the 1970s. So the narrowing of the curriculum that I talked about earlier, it's probably arising because of more of an emphasis on cognitivism. So this is about very clear, structured and sequenced learning. It's similar to the tabula rasa in that it's about putting things into the brain that weren't there before, although it's formulated in a different way. So it's not about the blank slate, but it is about making new neural connections in the brain, and it has some elements of an understanding of cognitive science within it. The point about cognitivism is the direction which things move. So the idea is that you learn things, you change what's going on in the brain, and that then changes the behavior of the individual. Behaviorism comes at it the other way around, and that says you start with the behavior and you change somebody's behavior, and by repeated changes of behavior, that's how they then learn something new. So external stimuli are prompting learning in behavior, and behaviorism, as you will know, has a lot to do with rewards and sanctions. I've got somebody else jumping in. They might be disagreeing with me, but I'll carry on going. So behaviorism has quite a lot to do with rewards and sanctions. Can be characterized as stimulus response, but it's about operant conditioning, which is where you're changing the behavior and then conditioning so that learning happens. And then I've just dropped collectivism in at the end there. So this is a relatively new term which people are exploring at the moment, and this is about learning, including where you're connecting with people online. So it's basically a form of constructivism, social constructivism, but allowing for electronic connections in there. So your pedagogy needs to be informed by some theories of learning. You need to understand how people learn. What has happened here in England is that some of these have really been emphasized at the expense of others. So we've seen a move towards didactic teaching, which works well with the tabula rasa approach. It's about, the teacher as the instructor, to use that American term, the teacher as the person who knows some stuff which they're going to get across to their students. And we're all familiar with that. We've all stood in a lecture theatre and we've all done exactly that. There's been a real emphasis in the last 10 years on cognitive science. So this is about understanding a bit about how the brain works. It really speaks to cognitivism. But our teachers today, all of the people that we train to teach today, are expected to have an understanding of, for example, cognitive load theory, dual coding, various things to do with cognitive science that would help you to create a better teaching and learning experience. And then because of this neoconservatism, which I've talked about, and the idea of central discipline, there's a lot of adult control. So we're being pushed towards the adult in the room, the teacher, the lecturer, being very much in control of what is being learnt. And in schools, this is pushing us towards much more emphasis on behaviorism. So especially rewards and sanctions, and making sure that obviously you'd want a well-ordered environment, but I think there are some extremes. If you look at some English schools, you'll see some extremes there in terms of how behaviour is managed to ensure that central discipline. The argument being that if you don't have good discipline, then the learning will be poor. Now, I think there is an argument for that. The way in which some people go about it, I would question though. So this now is really very much seated in neoconservatism. So that definition that I gave you a bit earlier, that this is what we're seeing happening within education at all levels. So the thing that's missing, the gap in there, is the social constructivism, which might have been where we might have come from, and that's really being edged out by central government policy at the moment. And you can see, I mean, you would see this in various different ways. So not just in the activities, but even in things like the room layout. So, you know, our politicians at the moment are very keen to see that people sit in rows. So as a science teacher, most of the labs that I taught in had little groups that would work around the services, so that, you know, the water and the gas taps and that sort of thing for when they're doing experiments, and the desks would be arranged in groups. Even down to the way that a classroom is laid out now. The Westminster government is saying, well, we have a view on this. We think they should sit in rows, looking at the teacher who's at the front, in control. The way that behaviour is managed, textbooks, the use of textbooks, and so on, all being defined by central government. You could argue that this is somewhat anti-intellectual. It's taking away the autonomy of the teacher, and it's turning the teacher into a technician. So as I've just described, some of our younger teachers who think, well, who don't think, who teach synthetic phonics because they know that's what they have to do, rather than because they've rationalized it, they've thought about, they've made those decisions, which we've just said is the basis of pedagogy, on the basis of their understanding of theories of learning. So it feels anti-intellectual. And you know, at the moment there is a debate going on about whether teachers even need to have a bachelor's degree, which I find worrying. I would have wanted to go the other way and say teaching needs to be a master's level profession, but you know, that's where we are here in England. There's another worry about this as well, I think, and that is, if you follow this approach, you run the risk of not meeting the individual needs of the pupils and the students in front of you. So if you take the neoconservative approach, and you become a technician, you do the didactic teaching, you understand cognitive science, you manage behaviour, you might, in doing that, marginalise some of your learners who are finding it really difficult to respond to this, to understand what's going on, and basically you're not meeting their needs. So those are some theories of learning. What I would say, so having criticised the neoconservative approach, I want to propose a different one. And this is what I do in my book. And I've got some ideas for some further writing I want to do around this. So for me, I would want to say that if we understand pedagogy, then we need to be what Levi Strauss would call a bricoleur. The bricoleur is someone who is able to take different tools and use the right tool for the right thing in that moment. So you're able to teach in a variety of different ways. So underneath there, a variety of bullet points. When I trained to teach, my tutor at university said to me, you need to understand horses for courses. So that's an English saying. It kind of means that you know the right tool for the job. There, you could argue that that makes you a jack of all trades and master of none, but I would disagree with that. I think the master is the person who knows which tool to use, not the person who's expert with only one tool. So bricolage pedagogy is a phrase that I would like to see being used more often in all of our educational establishments. And that means saying the teacher is someone who understands theories of learning, is able to choose when to use one and when to use another, who recognizes there is no single approach, and who, in our context, therefore challenges the policy decisions that are being made. I think if we can train teachers, and this is, you know, in my institution, these are the teachers that I want to train. If we can train teachers who are good at bricolage, who are good at choosing this thing, choosing that thing, depending on the task that's at hand, then we will have trained really good teachers who are able to think, who are able to have that discourse around pedagogy and turn it from an act into an art. They also need to know, I should say, what not to do. So we have had various things which in England are called neuromyths or fads, which have run the course. And some of these come from poor understanding of cognitive science. So, for example, for a while, there was a little fad going around about thinking about left brain, right brain. This person's a left brain learner, that person's a right brain learner. And despite what we know about the different emphases of the different hemispheres in the brain, we also know it does not work like that. The brain works as a whole thing. Some people have different strengths and weaknesses, but you can't just label this as a left brain task, and you can't label that as a left brain person. Similarly, we had a thing around brain gym. So brain gym was around the notion that if you exercise, your brain works better. And there were various commercial things that were peddled, that schools would buy, that would encourage little exercises that you do in the middle of, you know, the maths that you're doing, or the English or the science, where you'd pause and you do some exercises, because that apparently would make your brain work better, and then you'd be able to learn more. Completely debunked, but people spent money on it and people spent time on it. Learning styles is another one. So visual, auditory or kinesthetic learning styles, and the fact that you should teach differently depending on the learning styles of your pupils and students, has been completely undermined by research, but at the time was quite strong in schools, and in fact was promoted by the government. So you couldn't blame schools for having done it. A good bricoleur, in my argument, the bricolage teacher who's using bricolage pedagogy will be able to look and say, I'm going to unpick the evidence for this thing and see if it's there before I choose whether to use it, and especially before I spend money or time on it. There are now resources available to help people do that. We have an organisation called the Education Endowment Foundation, which does a lot of research around looking at the effectiveness of different approaches. And you will have read probably things like John Hattie's work, which tries to measure the validity and the impact of a variety of different pedagogical approaches. So the tools are there for teachers to be able to use bricolage pedagogy, and I would like to see them doing that more. Let me give you a quick example from nuclear physics. You don't need to know any nuclear physics to understand this, but hopefully it will help you to see why I think bricolage pedagogy is really important. And it may be really obvious to you, but let me tell you, this is not obvious for people who have only been through the English system and think that cognitivism is the only approach. So nuclear physics. This is something that I might have taught, so sixth form students in school or first year at university, perhaps. You need to understand the basic particles that there are in nuclear physics, okay? And there is the table showing all the particles that we know of at the moment. It's a bit small for you to see, but it does have some of their properties which students need to understand. Now, you're not going to do that through social constructivism. It's not going to be a good use of time to have students sitting down discussing what they know about these particles. Basically, the facts are there on that slide and they need to learn them. This is a cognitivist way of learning. I know this stuff. I know that you need to know it. And so you're going to have to go away and you're going to have to learn these things. And I might do some little tests to see how well you know them. But basically, the information on the slide there has to get into your head. That is the kind of learning that we're talking about here. Once you know that, and this is why I said earlier that I think there's a real strong argument for saying that sometimes knowledge is important before you move on to skills. Once we know that, we can move on to nuclear equations. And the way that you would teach nuclear equations is by giving some examples and then the students practicing doing them themselves. This is about behaviorism. This is about repeatedly going through the same sort of exercise many times over, initially following the example, gradually doing it more on your own 2 feet, and developing the skill of writing nuclear equations so that you can understand what's happening here, how energy might be generated or absorbed, and how those particles interact with one another to create some of the things that we see happening in the natural world. So as the bricoleur teacher here, I would have used first one method in my teaching, and then a completely different method to move on to the next stage of what they need to learn. But then I might take it and use a third method and say, well, now that you understand what these particles are, now that you understand how energy is created in nuclear equations, now we can have a discussion about nuclear power, okay, which is on our curriculum. You can't really do it properly until you understand the basis of nuclear physics, but now we can. So we can talk about whether it's safe, how much energy you get, the whole reason why nuclear fusion is going to create lots more energy than nuclear fission, but also the questions around why it's harder to do, and about what the waste products might be and how safe they are and half-lives and all the rest of that. There, it's absolutely appropriate to start having a debate about this, for different people to say, well, this is what I understand by it. This is why I think this is important. This is why I think this is dangerous. So that would be a specific example related to nuclear physics that takes us through bricolage pedagogy, that says use one method, then use a different one, then use a different one. And for me, that is what we should be encouraging people to do in their teaching, whether they're teaching 3-year-olds or whether they're teaching 23-year-olds at university. Same principles hold for me. Okay, we were going to have a pause there. I'm looking at the clock and I'm not going to give you this pause. So we'll come back to questions at the end and I'll just plow on if that's okay, because I think it's important that we get to higher education. So many of the principles that I've just talked about apply in higher education, although they work out in slightly different ways. I don't know how things are for you in Malaysia, but for us, these are the characteristics of English universities that are quite important. They're independent. So each university is independent of another and also of the government. So they're independent, standalone institutions that make their own rules. They are autonomous, and they have a great deal of autonomy over how they use their resources, over how they teach, and also over what they teach. So I'm sure this is the same for you. I just said we started a new degree in special educational needs. As a university, we decided what was going to go into that degree course. We planned out the curriculum for 3 years. We decided what the assessment mechanism were going to be. We decided how many credits each module would have and so on. So complete autonomy is what universities have been used to. Because of that, there is actually a genuine marketplace. So it's not like schools. There is a real marketplace, in as much as school leavers who are choosing universities have absolute free choice over what university they choose to apply to and spend their money. So, you know, that we have tuition fees here. So students will go to university and they will choose to spend their money at which university they go to. In principle, universities can set the tuition fees. In practice, that doesn't really happen because the government puts a cap. So nobody's allowed to charge more than £9,000 per year for an undergraduate degree. And the reality is what happens there is almost everybody charges £9,000. Nobody's going to charge less because it makes it look as though it's a lesser product. But there is a genuine marketplace. There is a difference between universities, and I've just put 2 pictures there to show you. So the bigger bottom picture is Nottingham Trent University. That's the campus on which I work, and which Johannes will be familiar with. And it's classed as a modern university. So that is, it gained university status in 1992. We have older universities, and the top one is a picture of Oxford. Obviously, you will have heard of Oxford, and they're older not just in terms of their buildings and their existence, but also in terms of some of their thinking as well. So they do have a different approach to pedagogy and to teaching and learning than the more modern universities do. For the most part, universities have not been used to inspection, but inspection is creeping in. So Ofsted was created in 1992. In recent years, Ofsted have begun to inspect some courses in universities, including education courses. So my department was inspected 4 weeks ago, which was lovely. We had 17 inspectors in for 4 days, just looking at everything they could get their hands on, trying to make a judgment. So universities are starting to get used to the idea that some of their work will be inspected. And just to give you a feel for numbers, so half of the country's population, half of our school leavers at the moment will probably go to university. When I left school, it was about 20%, about a fifth. So over that 40 years, that's grown quite significantly, and that was deliberate growth. It was prompted by government policy. So that's where we are as universities and higher education. There hasn't been any consistent use of metrics until the last 5 years or so, a bit more than 5 years. So there have been metrics around higher education, and universities have been put into league tables by newspapers, but they've used different metrics. So different publishers have produced different league tables depending on the things that they measured. Those metrics are starting to be rationalized now. And there are 3 key metrics for English universities now: the REF, the TEF, and the KEF. The REF is a Research Excellence Framework. So that came in 2014. There was a predecessor metric, which was very similar with a different name for 10 years or so before that. So this measures the quality of the research that's going on. And the particular measure inside that universities look at is how much of the research is world-class or world-leading. The TEF is the Teaching Excellence Framework that came in 2016, and this gives universities a badge, which is either bronze, silver or gold, on the basis of the quality of their teaching. I'll come back to that one in a moment. And then the most recent one, which we're still trying to get our heads around, is the KEF, which is about knowledge exchange. So this is about how your research and your teaching is applied in the community. It looks at how much commercial income you generate, and it looks at the number of different organizations your university works with outside of higher education. As I say, that's new, and it's still being worked on. The first version of that was published in 2021, and we will get a second version coming out this year. For our purposes today, thinking about pedagogy, obviously the middle one is important. And in order to understand how to give your gold, silver or bronze badge to a university, the TEF looks at 2 particular things. It looks at student outcomes and it looks at student experience. Now, this is probably a bit more refined than what happens with schools, where it's nearly all about outcomes. And, you know, lots of us might say, but education is about an experience, it's a process, it's a thing you go through. It's not just about outcomes. When I sent my children to the village school along the road, the main thing was I wanted them to come home each day feeling happy, obviously having learned some stuff, but I wanted them to come home wanting to go back to school the next day. The experience is important. It's not just about the outcomes. In order to understand this, they use various surveys. So this is about asking students about their experiences. So the National Student Survey for undergraduates, PTES is the postgraduate survey, and then a graduate outcome survey, which now surveys university leavers. I think it's 18 months after they've left university. And then also universities' own data around continuation and progression. So just looking at how many people make it from year 1 to year 2 of their bachelor's degree, how many make it to the end of the degree, and then how many get higher classes of degree when they come out of it. So those are some of the metrics, and this is how neoliberalism is working for universities at the moment. And then this begins to have an impact on our pedagogy, because obviously we need to be thinking about making sure that people are equipped to go into graduate level jobs. At Nottingham Trent, one of the things that we tried to do over the last couple of years is make sure that every single course in the university has an opportunity to work with employers. So a work-like experience is what we call it. Every student will have done some work with real employers out there in the real world, and hopefully that will contribute to their employment stats as they leave. And you can see this is about playing that neoliberal game. And as I said to you at the beginning, I showed you some of the awards. This is the reason why, you know, universities will say, this year we got Modern University of the Year, we got our TEF Gold, we are this place on the league tables. All the universities will do that. You can't really blame them for doing it. but it feels uncomfortable. We've got 35,000 students doing all sorts of different courses. How can you sum the teaching and learning up in one word? Gold. To me, that doesn't make sense, but nonetheless, that's the game that we're in. We have a new regulator who came in 2018 called the Office for Students, and it is their job to regulate the work of the universities. Regulation includes things like value for money, academic experience, employment, and they are the people that give a university degree awarding powers. They look at quality and standards under those 5 headings that you can see in the bullet points there, and it is the Office for Students that gives you your TEF award. Moving on quickly into pedagogy. At the moment, universities are kind of lagging a bit behind schools. So universities have moved away from the traditional lecture seminar approach and towards more social constructivism. So we will be talking about things like flipped learning, scale up. Some of these things I know Johannes will have heard about when she came to visit us. Team-based learning, problem-based learning. Our university doesn't do much in the way of MOOCs, massive open online courses. Some universities do, but what we're starting to see is the impact of neoconservatism, which is pushing this balance back towards the left-hand side of the screen. Students are saying, I'm paying for my degree. So I think, therefore, I'm paying for someone to just tell me the stuff I need to know, and then I'll reproduce that in exam conditions. They sometimes don't want to engage in the hard work that's involved in flipped learning, team-based learning, because they think they're paying for a service. So there's a sort of neoliberal shift there that pushes them towards neoconservative pedagogies, and you get a curriculum shift in the curriculum balance. That tend to use pedagogy because it's more inclusive, because andragogy has a male root. But just to say, I recognise the fact that as learners get older, the nature of pedagogy might well change. But this thing about students as consumers is probably the thing that's making the biggest difference at the moment. We talked about the purposes of education and why we have a curriculum. There was a very influential report that was written by Robbins in 1963, which we still live by, which says these are the objectives of higher education. So yes, there is something about future careers, and note that it's at number 1 here. Promoting general powers of the mind. And then research, which we talked about, which is measured through the REF, and culture and citizenship, which might be measured through the KEF. But the first 2 have to do with teaching and learning. I would say over the last 10 years, the balance here is shifting. Okay, so the general powers of the mind and broadening the mind is waning in favor of pushing people towards particular careers. And to come back to what somebody said earlier about the difference between teaching and training, and it seems to be moving towards training at the moment. And I just want to go back to, I said we would come back to the 1970s. So Lyotard, who is the person who coined the performativity phrase and our understanding of performativity, he wondered if we're starting to see the death knell for the professor. So the stimulation of imaginative minds and the general powers of the minds is waning. Reproduction of professional skills seems to be increasing, can be simplified, turns people into technicians. What Lyotard said, and this is a long time ago, he said that in both of these cases, what we're seeing is the death knell of the age of the professor. We won't need lecturers because we can use electronic networks. He called them memory bank networks. We might call them MOOCs now, that can transmit established knowledge. So you don't need the lecturer. You don't need social constructivism, because people will be able to just log on, learn the stuff, reproduce it in an exam, get their degree. And the sort of general powers of the mind would just be confined to a very small number of people, because actually it doesn't contribute to economy and employment and so on. That was his fear. I don't think we've reached that point. And what I would say is, in order to challenge that, we have to be the bricklayer. And I would say, long live the bricklayer. We need to be people who are able to choose and use pedagogy in the appropriate way, and not allow our roles to be taken over, whether it's electronically or whether it's by political technocrats. We have to be the bricklayer, and we have to fight against the system in that way. I was a bit of a rush at the end, so apologies for that, but I'll stop sharing now. Just about made it by my clock anyway in time. Trying to get you all back. So I'm open to questions if we've got time for that, Johannes. I'm sorry, I've taken us right up to the limit there.
I think that there's some in the chat sections. I think we
Okay.
can wrap up, yeah, through reading that a little bit, and then we can conclude the talk session. Yeah.
I have a question. Is it very important to look at current issues such as neoliberalism and other issues in developing the curriculum? If so, yes, I think it is, because it fundamentally, you can't design your curriculum until you know why you're doing it. So, you know, in our country, if we don't understand the demands of neoliberalism, then we would write a curriculum in a vacuum. And that might then not meet the needs of the state, which I think, you know, we have to at least attempt to do. Or alternatively, it might mean that we write a curriculum which is then criticised by the monitoring and the judgment mechanisms that we have here through inspection and through our league tables. So I think you do need to understand that. Now, it may be that you say, as I do, okay, neoliberalism says this about the curriculum. I'm not completely comfortable with that. So what I have to do is write a curriculum that meets the needs and the requirements of the state, but also gives the opportunity to open minds and light flames and get all excited as well. So I think it is important to have that political understanding. And that's why I wrote my book, really, because for me, that's for people who are studying and learning about education and training to teach. They need to understand the context in which they're doing that. Otherwise, they become automatons, and all they do is they learn some stuff and then they reproduce it. And I think that would be very sad if we reach that stage. So somebody else is also making a comment about that same question. Okay, about the difference between neoliberalism and old. So yeah, I don't think it's the best title, but it is the internationally used title, neoliberalism, and it's about liberalism in the market. So it's not about liberalism as in progressive liberal education as we would understand it. That's a distinct difference. So neoliberalism is about freedom in the market and a small state not controlling the market. That's specifically what it's about. And when it tips over into neoconservatism, where you've got a strong state in terms of discipline, but still allowing the freedom in the market. So that's very distinct from liberal progressive education, which we were talking about before. Somebody said there, what is liberalism is not a problem in Malaysia, which I think is interesting. I mean, the issue with progressive liberalism that we had here in the 1970s is that the state had not just control, but no measure of what was going on in schools. Nobody understood what was happening, what children were learning. So I do think there was a problem. I don't think the solution that we came up with was necessarily the right one. But it's interesting that you think there isn't a problem in Malaysia, which is good. What if a critique of government or governing ideology is not desirable in and by education institutions? Is progressive model of education a colonial legacy? Yes, I think it is. Okay. So what would be a decolonial theory of learning in a post-colonial setting? Well, I think that's really interesting to explore. You know, we need in here, as the colonizer, we also need to learn about decolonialism, and that's certainly a conversation that's going on in our universities at the moment. How do we try to move beyond colonial models of education and move to a more post-colonial, postmodern, you might argue, model of education? How do we learn from other countries as well, in the same way that I just said, you know, I'm really interested in learning from what's going on in Kenya. So you might argue that nationally we are discouraged from critiquing the government ideology. I don't think that that's a good argument to not do it, and I think it's healthy in a democracy to be able to have that critique. So yes, what if it's not desirable? There will be some people that say it's not desirable. I think in terms of the value that we hold for free speech here, and for the fact that we are an open democracy, you have to be able to critique government philosophy. And you know, more positively than that, I would say you try and critique it in a way that helps to change it for the better. You know, I'm not in a game of just saying, oh, I want to critique this, I want to say it's not very good and then walk away. I would want to be able to offer and contribute to conversations around how to make it better. So the latest paper that I've just co-written with a group of other people who work in a similar role to me was very definitely a position paper that put back to the government some issues around our teacher training curriculum, which is centrally defined by the government, to say these are some of the reasons why we think it's not right, but here are some ways which we think it could be changed for the better. So I think critique of government policy is important, but I think it needs to be done in as constructive a way as it can be, and it depends on, you know, what sort of policy context you live within as to how constructive that can be. Here in the UK, we are able to make comments to government. Now it's up to them whether they listen or not, but we are able to make those comments, and sometimes we have a forum where we can have that conversation. So we do meet. I meet 3 times a term, 3 times a year, once a term, 3 times a year with government officials, where we can at least get some of these views over. And you know, you kind of wait and see what happens to policy. It doesn't always go in the way that you'd want it to, but at least there's a chance to have a voice there. So I think it's important to understand policy and to be able to make those comments back.
So I think we can conclude here. Thank you, Chris. I think we would really like to discuss further and probably have a longer academic discourse. Unfortunately, we are out of time. And thank you, everyone, for your participation and staying with us to the end.